Does that mean then that for all the talk that Vladimir Putin was merely bluffing, if some senior Russian military leaders did actually get together to discuss potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, there might be substance behind the fears?
Well, I think we always have to assume that there could very well be substance behind what Putin is saying about nuclear weapons. But I think what they were talking about is a couple of weeks ago, U.S. Military leaders they called the Russians and talked to them about this sabre-rattling. So it wasn't necessarily Russian generals getting together, having a meeting, pulling in the U.S. I think this is a conversation that might have even been started by the U.S., trying to warn off the Russian military, saying, don't even think about using a tactical nuclear weapon, that this would be just more heartache and more cost to Russia without any benefit on the battlefield. So I think this was a discussion between the U.S. and the Russian military authorities about nuclear weapons, and particularly the U.S. message, don't do it.
From your experience in this area, Jim, do you have any sense of how that conversation might have gone and how the Russians might have responded to those kinds of threats, behind the scenes?
Well, I think the Russian military, they're under a lot of pressure right now. They haven't performed very well on the battlefield, as you know. This has been problem for the Russian generals, for the officers around Putin. So they're not about to say something to American generals that is something outside the party line from Putin. I'm sure there are a lot of ears listening in on those telephone conversations in Moscow. I'm sure that if there was anything said between the militaries that were off script for Moscow, that general might have been pushed out of an open window. So I think that I think it was probably a very sobering discussion. I think it's something where the U.S. military had a message to deliver, which, as I said, was there's no value in this. Of course, it's Putin's call, but I think for the U.S. military is making sure that the Russian military counterparts understood that the U.S. and the West were going to respond to something to make it very painful. So I'm sure it was a sobering discussion. It was one of plain talk. Very frank talk between the militaries, and I think messages were sent back and forth.
Yeah, and talking of frank, Jim, I'm just looking back at quotes from last month, and I think on October the 6th or 7th, President Biden warned that the world could face, quotes, Armageddon if Vladimir Putin used a tactical nuclear weapon to try and win that war in Ukraine. And then last week, you'll remember, I'm going to quote Vladimir Putin, he said, I'm convinced that sooner or later, both the new centers of a multipolar world order and the West will have to start an equal conversation about a common future for us, and the sooner the better, of course. And he added that he thought the West was losing its dominance and quickly becoming a minority on the world stage. A shift, in a way, from Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think, the speech you're referring to, there's been abuse that this was actually helped to lower tension.
Yeah.
That Putin himself kind of didn't rattle that nuclear saber the way he had done in the past. And the Armageddon point that
President
Biden made, that has been, I think, has lost its oomph, if you will.
Yeah.
It's lost some of its juice over time. So I think right now, because the conversations that we're talking about here between the Russian and the American generals, that was in October. The Putin speech that you just referenced was in October, and also the Biden remark. And I think we're at a place now where the saber rattling is not as loud as it might have been back then. Remember, too, NATO had a nuclear exercise. The Russians had a nuclear exercise as well. But things have gotten kind of quiet. And I think, remember also, frankly, last October, also to talk about Ukraine and a dirty bomb, which was just totally ridiculous. So I'm hoping that what we're going to see in this new month of November is not going to have that kind of noise. If what Putin said in his speech, we've got our midterms getting ready to happen here. So Biden and everyone, we're all focused on the midterm elections just around the corner. So let's hope that November, in terms of nuclear saber rattling, is going to be a little quieter.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainians might be concerned that the Western capitals, the Western allies, are getting tired, getting fatigued, and that's what Vladimir Putin is counting on, isn't it?
That's exactly right. What Putin is counting on is not just that fatigue, but also that they become frightened, whether it's in the U.S. or it's in the West, in Europe, that they become frightened by this nuclear talk. So I think you're absolutely right about Putin in terms of hoping that things will happen politically in the United States or within Europe during the cold winter, fractures appear, or there's fear generated by this idea of nuclear escalation. That Putin's hope is that will lead to a reduction in support to the Ukraine military.
Well, we'll have to see, Jim. Thank you very much indeed. That's Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO under Obama-Biden administrations.